Okay, we are good. So I am, yeah, unfortunately, yeah, I think I'm relatively pun free, but I am here today, this morning, this evening, in the future when you are watching it, going to wrap up the yearly talks by talking about werewolves, which I am very excited about. And I'm very excited that so many of you are kind of vaguely aware of werewolves. Oh, there was almost one there. I'll stop myself. So as per the title, we are going to look a little bit more at folklore and fairy tales, but I will end up sort of finishing in the supernatural romance, just because of my own research area. So like really quickly, I did my master's in fairy tale and folklore. I was originally a folklorist, and then I did my PhD in young adult supernatural romances. But for both of them, I was looking at contemporary-ish retellings of the Little Red Riding Hood fairy tale. And one of the connecting threads between those two projects was how the wolf, or the werewolf as the case may be, how they're represented in the many retellings, and sort of how they're used as a little bit of a negotiation around, you know, fears, anxieties, cultural commentary, sort of everything that a fairy tale in literature kind of is. What I found particularly interesting though is that they weren't just sort of these big scary monsters and nothing else, you know, whether that be like a literal wolf or a werewolf or an anthropomorphic character, but they became, like I said, these sources or symbols of current social and cultural concern and anxiety. And you can kind of, depending on what field you're in, you can track what people are being worried about based on the reincarnation of the werewolf. And I would kind of expand that to say pretty much any monsters become, you know, indicative of what we're afraid of, particularly if you've done any like sort of horror research. And, you know, once we get to the supernatural romance sort of section, or the contemporary supernatural romance in general, we can also see that the wolf becomes a figure of intrigue and desire. So we've got sort of that at the end. Now, I obviously really like Little Red Riding Hood. It was sort of my main research area. So I'm actually going to use variations or the history of that fairy tale as a bit of a framework through which we can look at the history of the werewolf, which is really good. Although just before we get into it, so in this talk, I'm going to focus predominantly on Western European folklore and fairy tales. So even within Europe itself, there's a really vast sort of array of the different incarnations of fairy tale traditions, and even a different kind of monster or big bad, as it were, to use a bit of a Buffy reference, based on sort of the biology or biodiversity, sorry, of each of the regions. And that's not even looking at, you know, how those tales were converted in their move to like the US and Australia and things like that. So we're a little bit niche, as it were, here. And I did mention before, but just in case, I am going to talk, although not graphically, about violence, cannibalism, and sexual assault in particular, as well as incest and murder. So we are wrapping the year up quite dramatically, I guess. I don't go into too much detail for that though. All right. I thought I would start though by talking a little bit about the fairy tale in general as more of a literary or a storytelling tradition. It's actually one of those genres that people have a general vague idea about, like they know it when they see it. But often people haven't really considered like the sheer scope of the history of the fairy tale. And to be honest, if they have, it's often a little incorrect or extremely incorrect, which is always a bit of an irritation to a folklorist. So broadly speaking, the fairy tale as a genre, it's traditionally defined as a short story or a tale that will feature elements of magic or enchantment or the supernatural. They're frequently placed under the larger umbrella of folklore. So those two terms are often used really interchangeably. I, full disclosure, do that all the time. I probably did like 2 seconds ago. But folklore itself is a much larger category, and it encompasses not just fairy tales, but things like mythology or proverbs or cultural celebrations, even more contemporary things like memes. It's essentially anything that can be collectively passed down between generations and people. That's actually why I really like folklore, because it's so broad. And I think a really good example of what folklore can encompass, it's actually one of my favorite Wikipedia pages. It's the page for Australian folklore in particular, because it has this immense sort of varied list of things that are classified. So we have cryptids, like we have drop bears and yowies. It has the history of bush rangers. It has like the Sydney Olympics, like opening ceremony. It has, you know, the list of big things. So we have a lot of like large things as tourist attractions, like the big banana, the big pineapple. And it all falls under that folklore umbrella, as does sort of the more traditional fairy tale. So there's a few different schools of thought regarding the history of the fairy tale. So I'm a cultural studies academic, and so I look at them as cultural artifacts, not just as stories. I'm also a literary academic, so I'm kind of in between there. So in this section, or in that respect, they're sources of cultural commentary, criticism, and engagement. So they're not, some people look at them as representations of like psychological development. Some people look at them as like examples of Jungian collective consciousness, which is, they're a bit too much for me. I just like them as evidence of what everyone was thinking at the time. And within the cultural studies field, fairy tales are generally classified as having what we refer to as a pre-literary history. So again, they're part of that oral folklore tradition, which means it's actually kind of difficult to identify for many of them like the original versions of them. And that's actually a really important point to note. So for a lot of fairy tales, not all of them, there are going to be exceptions, but for a lot of them, there's no one real original version that we can say this is the first one and this is where it started. Many people think that the Grimm brothers created a lot of the fairy tales. Old mates here. They actually didn't, they were retellers. That's a big issue of mine. People always go to that. But we do have sort of like first literary versions. So Charles Perrault, who is on my left, I can't speak for everyone else. He wrote a lot of the first literary versions, for example, but he took them from tales that were already in existence and already centuries old. So it's kind of this really murky history in respect to that. And I have these three images up here because they encapsulate, so there's a scholar called Christina Bakalega, and she has a really, really useful way of defining the fairy tale history as people know it generally, or sort of like mainstream media know it. And she calls it the Perrault, Grimm, Disney triad of fairy tale traditions, which is who we have here: Perrault, the Grimms, and Disney. It's kind of the big three of fairy tale people, or creators, or retellers, as they were. And she argues that this creation of the triad is actually a little bit of a disadvantage to fairy tale history, because it kind of smooths out what's a really long and intricate history. People either think of Charles Perrault, particularly if you're in France, they think of the Grimm brothers, or they think of Disney. Part of the reason I actually really like Little Red Riding Hood is that they don't have a Disney animated version. One of the issues of Disney is that he stopped kind of that retelling cycle. And so, we have Snow White here, which is his first feature-length movie. And it was also his first fairy tale retelling. And most people think of this Snow White when we are thinking of any other, rather than any other variants. If not explicitly the movie, then you think of like her character design, for example. If anyone had seen any particular like discourse around any of the contemporary Little Red Riding Hood's Little Mermaids, there's a lot of discussion around her hair color, because she needs to have red hair because that's what Ariel had, rather than being like one of the many different variations. Anyway, I could complain about Disney all day. We will not. We will talk about wolves instead, which is why I'm here. So both from a historical perspective, I want to discuss it, but I also want to draw on, or I want to identify a really particular kind of fear that wolves instill. And it's this fear that was used in a lot of fairy tale traditions. And it's not just for wolves, it's also been used in other forms of monsters. Now, from a more contemporary perspective, I do know that in Europe, at least, and in America, there's been multiple attempts at like rewilding and reintroductions to varying degrees of success of wolves. This was after some really dedicated eradication attempts throughout the centuries, but historically they were quite widespread across Europe, including in the UK and Ireland. And as a result of this, wolves are actually quite central in a lot of oral folklore and traditions, dating to the Middle Ages and even earlier. So I don't look at it because it's mythology, but the creation of Rome, for example, and the story of Romulus and Remus, wolves are very important in that. And in these stories, they featured as both metaphorical and literal senses of fear and danger. So that big bad wolf of the fairy tale could just as much be, actual wolves living in nearby forests, which pose literal danger, but they could also be metaphorical figures. They could be representative of, the fear of violence, assault, and cannibalism. And it's that sort of threat of consumption that I want to talk about. So the fairy tale tradition has a long history of what, there's an academic called Carolyn Daniel, she refers to it as monstrous eating, which I think is a really good descriptor. And it refers to, the stories that feature monsters, ogres, werewolves that catch and kill predominantly children in the fairy tale tradition. And this all stems from a really common fear that people have regarding large carnivores. And it's the fear of being eaten, but it's a little more than that. So large carnivore animals like wolves, bears, etc., they create this distinct sense of unease and anxiety in people. And it's this existential terror that accompanies the realization that we are not part of the food chain, or we're not the top of the food chain, sorry, we're part of it, we're enmeshed within it. You know, that thought or that realization that we're prey animals that can be eaten by something larger and stronger than us. And this disrupts what is sometimes referred to as the master monster narrative that many people have when they think about, you know, their place within the animal kingdom. You know, most people don't consider themselves as being part of the animal kingdom, for example, right? I mean, categorically that is correct, but I feel like that would be a very difficult thing to hold on to if you were being eaten by a wolf or a bear. I don't know. We don't have large carnivores in this country, so I have a very healthy respect for them all. But this monstrous eating, and even just the presence of like a man-eating animal, as it were, in the fairy tale tradition and in this oral and literary folktale tradition, can be seen as a really strong response to the material reality of pre-modern Europe. And we had not just, you know, the threat of animal violence or attack, but we also had things like famine, child abandonment, and lycanthropy, which I put in very heavy inverted commas. Actually, we'll wait there. So that actually brings us to our first sort of incarnation of Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf. Not quite a werewolf yet. As an aside, Lupus in Fabula, by the way, which is the title of this, it means wolf in the fairy tale or wolf in the story. It's one of my favorite little phrases. It's a Latin variation of, it's essentially, it means speak of the devil. So if you mention the wolf in the fairy tale, he will turn up. It's the, you know, speak of the devil, and he will appear, which I really like. So it's a nice easing into our Latin section, which I don't speak, so it's all in English. So as I said, the fairy tale as we know it, it's got this really long history, and depending on what scholars you look at and what field you're in, you can connect it back to the sort of ancient mythologies. Other people only consider those 17th century literary retellings as the origins of the fairy tale. So I personally adhere to the argument that the tradition can be found within sort of medieval lore and tales, both written and oral variations of them. So there's a medieval scholar, as in a scholar of medieval literature and linguistics, sorry, not from the time period, called Jan Ziolkowski. He wrote a really fantastic book called A Fairy Tale from Before Fairy Tales, the medieval Latin past of wonderful lies. And he looks at the origins of fairy tales, not just as these oral folk tales, but as written Latin or sort of medieval texts, which creates this really like unique and really rich little connection of history. Sorry. So he actually theorizes that we can see elements or threads of the Little Red Riding Hood fairy tale in a particular, I guess, source. And it's Egbert of Liège's The Well-Laden Ship, or The Richly Laden Ship, depending on your translation. That's a Latin poem that's a collection of fables, folk tales, Bible allusions, stories, proverbs, nursery rhymes. It's got a lot, actually. It was designed to act as a bit of an introductory reader for students. I believe, although I would need to double check, I think it's one of the few complete medieval sources that are still available that is written exclusively for education. So I think that's quite cool. What I want to talk about today is the short stanza in The Well-Laden Ship called About a Girl Saved from Wolf Cubs, which is what I have on the screen here. So you can see it's really short, but it follows the story, or it tells the story of a young girl who is kidnapped or taken by a wolf as an intentional meal for her wolf cubs. So again, to something to be consumed, right? She ends up being unharmed in this scenario, and it's because of the red hooded cloak that she's wearing, which she was given as a gift by her godfather on her baptism day. So in this variation, it's kind of the protective power of a Christian God who's not only, you know, preventing the wolves from eating her, but they're also removing, or they're also removing the ferocity from the wolves, and it allows the young girl, who maybe the proto Red Riding Hood, to exist peacefully within a little wolf pack, albeit temporarily. What's really interesting about this, the opening sentence kind of sets it up as a really well-known or already established story. So the country folk, you know, could already tell you this because they're well versed in it, which is kind of acknowledging that it's widely disseminated or at least recognizable. That being said, I have read that Egbert of Liège, the author, was not particularly forthcoming with where he got these stories from, so he might have just been using that to add a bit of like rustic charm. But you know, so for this particular stanza or verse, the connection between this and Little Red Riding Hood is at times a little contested. If you go even vaguely into fairy tale studies, you'll notice that there's a lot of contestation from all different sides. So it really depends on the scholar that you're reading and how many kind of elements that you will associate with Little Red Riding Hood. So for me, for example, I think the red cloak and the presence of the wolves do a lot of the heavy lifting to create this connection. Particularly if we think of the fairy tale history, not as this linear chronology, but maybe a bit more of a web or a net. Christina Bacalaga again uses that quite well. You can see this as being a connecting thread rather than part of a, you know, again, chronological line. So I like it as a little bit of a background info. And also in this case, what's really interesting is that we can see that the wolf is a literal wolf, or they are literal wolves, my apologies. Arguably, you know, they are standing in a little bit of fear for, you know, the fear of being unbaptized or the fear of the corrupting influence of the devil, which we are able to be protected from our red cloak, from our baptism. All right, we have a few different like time skips here. Another early example that I really love is the story of grandmother. It's sometimes referred to as the false grandmother. It's sometimes referred to as La Finta Nonna because it has a really strong Italian history. It focuses on the wolf as being a really real danger and a figure that needs to be outsmarted. And that in this version, he is outsmarted, which is nice. And it also has a really nice interpretation of the young girl. We say the Red Riding Hood figure, but she isn't actually ever described as wearing a red hood or cloak. But in creating this presentation, I found if you do search images for La Finta Nonna or the false grandmother, pretty much all that turns up is Little Red Riding Hood imagery. So at least now it is really, really closely connected to the story, or in contemporary minds. So depending on what version you're reading, there's a few sort of variations in dates as well as in some of the terminology. Averaging it out, we generally see this as being sort of a medieval-ish variant, heavy on the ish. And in this version, the young girl is on a walk through the woods to see her grandmother, so it's very recognizable. She runs into a wolf. Now in some versions, the wolf is described as a Vizou, V-Z-O-U. Which is a bit of a weird one, but it's also really common in this sort of incarnation or in this time period. It's a relatively now unused term for werewolf or monster. So we can see that in this instance, at least, you know, the wolf is already assuming that lycanthropic form. And there's a theory or a school of thought here that this monsterizing, as it were, of the wolf allows for it to represent two distinct fears at this time period. So one, as always, the threat of a literal wolf, which is still quite populous at this time, but also at the same time, I want to say a very real fear. It wasn't quite real in the sense, but it was the fear of werewolves, which was a genuine concern for several centuries. So in this variation, as I've got sort of in the quote here, the wolf asks the young girl where she's going, and she says she's going to her grandmother's house. So the Vizou or the wolf races ahead, and as we can see here, he eats the grandmother and leaves parts, sections. I'm not quite sure how to describe it. He leaves bits of the grandmother for the young girl to consume. In this one, it's just what appears to be like raw meat on a plate, but in other variations of this, the wolf somehow has time to bake the grandmother into a pie. In all variations, the girl will drink the blood and eat her grandmother in whatever incarnation it is. So again, there's some really interesting sort of discussions to be had in the comparison between the raw and the cooked there, as well as this idea of like civilization and the eating and sort of the cooking of meat that makes you more civilized. That's sort of its own little different path. But we also have some points to be made, or some really interesting discussion around endophagy or endophagy, depending on how you pronounce it. That just means cannibalism within your own peer group or family. And exophagy is like outside of it, but, you know, learning something new every day. Either way, though, there is sort of a really cannibalistic undertone here, as well as that concern of being consumed. And you could argue here that it's both literal in the sense of she does eat her grandmother, but it can also be seen as metaphorical because there's a lot of discussion around like the aging process. And so she's assuming the role or the older generation is sort of being replaced or being consumed by the younger generation. Again, this is very dependent on, you know, the way in which you analyze fairy tales. So after this consumption, the wolf then convinces the young girl to strip and get into bed with him. And it's at this point that she realizes that it's a wolf and not her grandmother. So she escapes and runs home. And there's also some scatological humor at that point in this variation. So after that discovery, she actually says to get out of bed that she needs to go to the bathroom. And the wolf is like, oh, don't worry, like do it in the bed, like that's no problem. And they have a little bit of back and forth about that before she finally convinces him she needs to go outside, and she runs away. So she saves herself by outsmarting the wolf and through her own intelligence, which is a really nice ending for it, although, you know, maybe not so much for the grandmother. As said before, this was written during a time period where wolves were really prominent still. And so this is particularly true of rural territories that are now part of like France and Germany and Italy, which is where a lot of these variations are seen to have originated from. As a result, it was really important that people, including children, were aware of the dangers of the surrounding forests and woodlands. You know, there was a very real fear of being attacked and killed by wolves. But this actually coincided with ongoing climate and societal issues at the time. So we have the medieval warm period, which led to this like explosion in population that was not matched by crop output or increase. There were several famines across Europe, including the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. And then after the medieval warm period ended, but before the Little Ice Age, we had like several years, I say we, they had several years of really sustained bad weather across the continent, which included summers that did not allow for crop growth. So it was not the most ideal time, and there was an increase in crime, disease, infanticide, and even, again, opportunistic and survival cannibalism because people lost their crops and food stores. They're at times forced to live in woodlands and, you know, add to their meals through hunting, whether that be through animals or potentially humans. So it makes sense then that at this time period, we have tales from this era that were warning listeners away from traversing the woods alone or at night or at all. And this is also the time that we see the werewolf trials get started. So the werewolf trials themselves, they're said to have begun in Switzerland alongside the Valais witch trials, of the 1400s. And then they spread across Europe and went on for a good few decades into the 1500s. So accusations of lycanthropy and the trials themselves, they reveal this mix of like religious fear and persecution along with actual crime. So people were accused, mainly men, were accused of attacking and killing children and young women. They're accused of cannibalism, and they were accused of stealing livestock as well. And many of them were charged for this. And at the same time, lycanthropy itself, or werewolfism, was also being debated as to its reality or accuracy. So it was seen at this time not only as a genuine malady, so people did truly believe in werewolves, but there was also, it was seen as a source of demonic possession, and it was seen as a source of mental illness or madness involving hallucinations. So it wasn't that everyone believed in werewolves at this time period. There were already debates happening. So one of the most famous werewolf trials or werewolves, as I have here, is Peter Stump or Stubber Peter, depending on your translation, known as the Werewolf of Bedburg. So he was a serial killer almost, if we can call them that, in the 1500s. His trial is probably the most well-known of the werewolf trials. So he confessed, although it was under torture, to being in possession of a magical clothing item. Now, depending on the translation, it was a vest or a belt or a girdle, but regardless, it was a gift from the devil, and it was this clothing that allowed him to transform into a werewolf. So it wasn't associated with, you know, the moon cycles or anything like that. Other werewolves under trial had admitted to having like creams or salves that would do the same thing, and there was a lot of magical clothes, and so we hadn't quite lent into the moon cycle lycanthropy. So Peter Stump confessed to killing livestock as well as humans, including pregnant women and their unborn children. He would eat the unborn babies. He called them dainty morsels, which is a very evocative phrase, if nothing else. He also confessed, to killing and eating his own son. And finally, during his werewolf trial, alongside him was one of his daughters, who he was accused of having an incestuous relationship with. And they were both found guilty, and they were executed on Halloween for the drama. They were broken on the wheel. I believe they were disemboweled. Then they were decapitated, and there were some heads on spike displays going on as a little bit of a warning. And this was also during the time period that figures such as Sawney Bean were said to be active, maybe not the best term. So Sawney Bean is Scotland's most famous cannibal. This is a great descriptor. He was said to be the head of a clan in the 16th century, which, according to legend, killed and cannibalized over 1,000 people over the course of like 25 or so years. The clan itself was also said to be the result of incestuous relationships between his children and grandchildren. And King James himself had sent out sort of an army to go and find them. It's a heavily contested story. It's generally thought to be completely an urban legend, but I think it's just really interesting to note that we see this consistent revulsion and intrigue in relation to cannibalism and sort of social and sexual deviance in that way. And this is all to say that at the time of the story of grandmother Olafintanona, the forest was filled not just with actual wolves who lived and hunted nearby, but potential, werewolves. And scholars actually argue that oral variants and areas that have strong traditions of Little Red Riding Hood, they can be found more commonly in regions where there were historically werewolf trials. And that makes sense, right? The wolf has been a really strong monster figure in these areas for a really long time. So as a result, they're changed and adapted to be like a default villain almost, molded to shape whatever we're worried about at that time. Okay. Again, more time skips. We're going to move on to the literary fairy tale. So I have a quote here from Angela Carter. She's very well known as a writer, but she's incredibly important within fairy tale scholarship as a translator of fairy tales, but also as a creator and reteller of them. And there's a really great phrase that she uses in particular in one of her interpretations of Little Red Riding Hood to describe the wolf. And it's that he's hairy on the inside, which I have here. So it's acknowledging that the wolf becomes or is becoming a more metaphorical threat rather than a literal one. And I think that's a really, really good description of what happens to the wolf figure as it transitions from the oral folktale to the literary fairy tale. So the oral folktales that I discussed before acted as inspiration for the literary fairy tale genre. And that's generally said to have emerged in the kind of 17th century and was particularly common and prevalent in the salons of Paris. So I actually think these literary salons were really fascinating. We'll allow for a slight deviation. So many of them were female dominated and took place in this really interesting cultural space that was between the public and the private. And that allowed women to both attend and host the gatherings. And these gatherings saw the beginnings of not only the literary fairy tale tradition, but also the genre, or it said the genre called amatory fiction, which is another female dominated like literary genre. In my thesis, I actually argue that both the literary fairy tale as well as amatory fiction can be seen as part of the broader history of the romance genre itself. And that's because by the 17th and early 18th centuries, we saw a decline in the popularity, or a massive decline in the popularity of the medieval chivalric romances, which is a genre that had been quite dominant in the storytelling tradition. And we see an unraveling of the supernatural from sort of mainstream or popular literature. And this unraveling and decline in popularity was in part sort of due to the long 18th century and the Age of Enlightenment, which contributed to increasing skepticism. But as a result, distinct literary categories started emerging, drawing on this unraveling or taking on these supernatural elements, such as the literary fairy tale. In relation to the female salons, so this space allowed for the resistance of prevailing 17th century ideologies that generally enclosed or encapsulated women in the domestic sphere. And so the female attendees of these salons were able to gain certain levels of independence in a space where they were able to engage in discussion of like politics and literature, of society, and even like cultural commentary and criticism. And one of the ways this took place was in the telling and retelling of folk tales that attendees already knew from their childhood. And using this, they were able to, so in the words of Jack Sipes, these are not mine, he says they exploited the presence of the marvelous, or the presence of enchantment, to allow for analysis of like the social issues of the time and stake out positions in the literary world. So until the late 17th century, folklore and folktales were considered sort of the domain of the lower classes or the working classes, as much as we can call them that at that time. They were seen as crude entertainment, which you could definitely see in variations like The False Grandmother, where there's cannibalism and a striptease and bathroom humor and things like that. They were generally brought to the upper classes through intermediaries, so your governesses, your household staff and things like that. And then they were brought into these salons through particular parlor games that were played there, where you were meant to construct this really unique narrative and tell a story that you were carefully rehearsing behind the scenes, but it was made to look quite spontaneous. And this time period is also where we see the creation of the term fairy tale. So Madame Delnoy, who I have here, she coined the term fairy tale conte de fées in her work, and she also wrote a lot of animal bridegroom tales, which we are going to talk about when we get to supernatural romances. And I had that little deviation there because if we're doing Little Red Riding Hood history, her first complete literary incarnation is generally actually said to be Charles Perrault's version, rather than any of the female salonières or conteuses they were called. So Charles Perrault, like I said, he's one of the points of that Perrault-Grimm-Disney triad. He's sort of the first. It's often called the father of French fairy tales because his literary retellings of fairy tales like Little Red Riding Hood and Cinderella and Bluebeard, they're generally considered to be the first literary versions of all of them. And that's a bit of a shame because it overlooks some of the female salon attendees and their work. So the other woman that I have here, Marie-Jeanne Gressier, she's actually Perrault's niece, and she was writing fairy tales and publishing them before he even sort of published his own work. We don't really hear a lot about that. We are going to talk about Perrault's version. So the image here is actually a little later. It's Gustave Doré's illustration of Perrault's retelling. It's from the 1800s, but it's really, really inextricably linked with that particular version, which is why I've included it. And this is where we see the wolf become, hairy on the inside, become less of a literal monster or werewolf and become a metaphorical wolf. So Perrault's Little Red Riding Hood has a lot more sexual references in it, in part because it was written in connection to or in connection to Versailles and the French court, which was itself a highly sexualized environment. And so many fairy tales of the time then became really loaded with innuendo and cultural and social commentary on the sexual behavior of the characters, who were themselves sometimes like thinly veiled references to court members. Now in Perrault's version, Little Red Riding Hood, it's very recognizable, but it doesn't actually end with the young girl outsmarting the wolf or being saved or even living. After she climbs into bed with the wolf, she is eaten, and that's it. So there's no saving there. But I argue that this ties in with another element that he added to his tales, which is, we have it here. In French, it rhymes, it doesn't here, but he's added a short rhyming moral to the end of each of his tales, kind of summing up what we really should have learnt from it. And this is one of my favorite translations because it refers to the smooth wolves, which I think is a really good description of them. So they're charming and witty and polite, and they use these powers to talk their way into young girls' bedrooms. And in the original French, the word that he uses is ruelle instead of bedside. So it's a really interesting word. It can be used to refer to an alleyway, like on a street. It can be used to refer to a small reception room. And a slightly older version of it refers to the space between your bed and the wall. And so it's been translated here as bedside. So you can see it's a very, very close and intimate space. So, as virginity was a requirement for marriage and sexual promiscuity was, encouraged for some people and heavily discouraged for others at this time, unmarried women must therefore be really careful who they let into their homes. So a seemingly polite, very charming figure may in fact be a dangerous wolf who will lead you astray, will rob you of your virginity. It's always the charming ones, right? It's always the smooth wolves. So the threat of consumption in this era has then become metaphorical. It's symbolic of sexual violence and assault rather than that dangerous literal wolf of previous years. So both the animal and the werewolf of the Middle Ages has become hairy on the inside or monstrous on the inside. And once attacked and consumed, like I said, in this variation, there's no saving of Red Riding Hood. You know, there's no third act where she's able to run home, or like in older versions or newer versions, sorry, there's no hunter or woodsman who's able to cut her out of the wolf. Speaking of, I do want to say chronologically, this is where the Grimm brothers would fit in. I'm not actually going to focus on their interpretations, but I do need to note that in English versions of Little Red Riding Hood, we took the title of Perrault's version, Little Red Riding Hood, but we actually based it, or it is based more on the Grimm brothers' Little Red Cap, where we do have that addition where the hunter, finds her and saves her and her grandmother, and we don't have a little rhyming moral at the end. So now we're going to get to the sexy werewolf. So we're going to do a massive jump into the 20th and 21st centuries. We're going to look at the eroticization and sexualization of the wolf and Red Riding Hood. So throughout the decades, particularly in the contemporary era, the wolf became much more malleable as a figure. So it was still a villain at times, but he was also, you know, a victim of deforestation, a representation of rewilding efforts, and of course he was still a literal monster. But similarly, Red Riding Hood had also undergone a lot of incarnations. So she became a hunter, she became an environmentalist or an activist, and even at times she herself became a wolf, whether that be the wolf figure or a wolf figure alongside the one that we know. Now, as I study romance, I'm going to focus on the reinterpretations of the wolf as a sexual partner and the ways in which the fairy tale intersects with the contemporary supernatural romance genre. So the supernatural romance, as it emerged in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it has this really interesting connection or reaching back across the history of romance. It draws on many different genres, and this includes the literary fairy tale, but it also includes things like Gothic literature and the Gothic romance. And we can't talk about Gothic anything, obviously, without mentioning Lord Byron, especially in the supernatural romance, just because, you know, the character trope of that tortured and mysterious hero provided a really strong foundation for the development of the romantic supernatural sort of character that we see in the contemporary incarnation. We always have a tortured vampire or a tortured werewolf or a tortured fallen angel. They're always very sad. They're always going through it. The Byronic figure themselves, you know, dark, brooding and passionate, often aristocratic man who lives a very private and isolated life, predominantly as a result of past trauma. And this is really sort of intersecting with the supernatural romance because we have a mysterious figure who's often hiding his supernatural identity. Again, very tortured, very traumatic. I am 100% sure that you mentioned this, or it was mentioned yesterday. I do have to say, Lord Byron is also, you know, a contributor to the creation of the contemporary vampire in English literature. It was partly the inspiration for Lord Ruthven, in Polidori's The Vampire. And by extension, as a result, the construction of the supernatural being as a romantic figure. I have to catch the recording for that. I was very upset that I missed it. In relation to the supernatural romance, what I like about it is that, like the fairy tale, it's really difficult to identify a single origin text for its contemporary incarnation. So some people, I have it here, they've named Chelsea Quinn Yarborough's Hotel Transylvania. I love the little tagline. It's a novel of erotic terror and forbidden love. What a winning combination. It's from 1978 and it features a romantic relationship between a vampire and a human, which I think we all figured out here. What's really interesting is that people often mention Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles as early examples, and they often cite that it's because of the sympathetic portrayal of the vampire figure, as well as the eroticization of the transformation into a vampire, as well as like the consumption of blood itself. What these books don't have, according to, like, they don't meet the requirements of a romance novel, they don't center a romantic relationship, and they lack that happily ever after ending that's really integral to any incarnation of a romance. They were also originally released as horror. Although I will say, if anyone has been watching the Interview with the Vampire series, it's definitely romantic. It's definitely eroticized is what it is. And we also, speaking of Anne Rice, her Sleeping Beauty quadrilogy, as it were, the Sleeping Beauty quartet, is also mentioned frequently as an early incarnation of the supernatural romance. That was released as erotic romance, or supernatural erotica, my apologies, rather than supernatural romance, although it was reissued as supernatural romance after the success of 50 Shades of Grey, which really opened the door for a reworking of a lot of older versions or older sort of stories. Also included these images just because I think they're absolutely fantastic covers, but they also really clearly identify the way in which supernatural figures become this erotic romantic source. These figures are all clearly drawing on like that traditional construction of Dracula, who himself was also not a particularly romantic character, but we have the vampire like the werewolf. They've been built up as a particular sexy tortured man for so long, which I think is a kind of interesting incarnation. But in general, this is a really interesting path for the contemporary fairy tale to take, right? So the genre itself is really closely associated with the child reader and children, particularly now. So eroticized retellings and reinterpretations have this extra level of like deviation from the norm. But even in the few incarnations and examples that I talked about before, we can see that there's still the containing, or there's still the presence of overt and covert sexual innuendos and references. So it makes sense that there's the potential for the implicit to be made explicit. But as a result, contemporary fairy tale retellings overall, when they intersect with sexualized retellings and erotica, fit really well into the supernatural romance. I've also just realized I haven't defined the supernatural romance. It's a subgenre of the romance that features a relationship between a supernatural being or a human, and a human, apologies. Sometimes it's between two supernatural beings, but the former is a lot more popular. And more specifically, in the contemporary supernatural romance, we see a lot of potential to revise and reinterpret the animal bridegroom fairy tale type in particular. So when we talk about the animal bridegroom fairy tale narrative, it's the story of a young female character who confronts and tames a supernatural or monstrous male figure through marriage and through love. So this narrative can be seen in numerous incarnations. So the Frog Prince, for example, is technically an animal bridegroom tale. The image that I have here is from East of the Sun and West of the Moon. I know it involves a bear rather than a wolf, but I can't talk about fairy tales and not include at least one Kai Nielsen artwork. He's the artist who did this, and his work is so beautiful. I love it so much. But I would say the most well-known animal bridegroom tale has got to be Beauty and the Beast, right? And it's absolutely a beautiful way to incorporate the supernatural romance. So it's the taming of a wild or beastly man through romantic love. And we can really see that in the traditional romance as well, more of a metaphorical beast, shall we say. During this taming of any of our supernatural boyfriends or our animal bridegrooms, we have plenty of opportunities to eroticize animalistic and beastly behaviors. So in the text that I studied in my PhD, for example, they were young adult, and so they weren't particularly explicit in their scenes of sexual activity. But what was present was frequently like eroticized descriptions of animal acts. So there was a lot of growling, there was a lot of biting. They were werewolves, so there was a lot of like sniffing and smelling each other. I had a whole chapter on that actually, because there was an immeasurable amount of it in the text. Both the romance and the supernatural romance and the fairy tale genres have really complex and conflicting relationships with their female readers and authors. So Linda J. Lee actually argues that the contemporary romance has in fact assumed the role of the fairy tale for the female reader. And that's because, in her words, they encapsulate collective fantasies and provide a way for women to subvert and resist patriarchal norms. So if we think back, we can draw that connecting line from the 17th century salons to these contemporary sort of reworkings and retellings. So similarly, you know, sexual desire and the desire for power entwine in these eroticized retellings in particular, examining those contemporary attitudes surrounding women and allowing that negotiation. Now, to actually further argue, as a slight aside, contemporary examples of the animal bridegroom tales could probably be more clearly recognized as monster romances rather than animal bridegroom tales. There's definitely been an increase in popularity and attention in the monster romance genre. I would argue it has broken containment somewhat and become even slightly mainstream. So I'm thinking of like Ruby Dixon's Ice Planet Barbarians. It's a massively best-selling series, although you know, there's discussion to be had about whether or not aliens would be classified as animal bridegrooms or supernatural romances, but I think it shows an interest and a preference in the genre regardless. But also, like, where does Little Red Riding Hood and her wolf fit into this? So the tale's a really interesting one. It's part of the collection of traditional fairy tales that, while it has historically contained sexual references and innuendos, it doesn't feature a romance and it doesn't end in a marriage. Despite this, the characters are frequently sexualized and placed in romantic relationships and situations in retellings. I'm looking at wolves exclusively in this section. We haven't even gone into the potential romantic relationship between Red Riding Hood and the hunter or the woodsman that often features in many variations. So the text that I studied across both of my projects, as well as many other contemporary retellings aimed at sort of a variety of audiences, they all feature romantic, if not overtly sexual, relationship between Red Riding Hood and the wolf. And in these reinterpretations, you know, Little Red Riding Hood has therefore joined the animal bridegroom or monster romance tale. Now, my own interpretation and analysis of this is that these changes kind of examine how the wolf becomes a figure of freedom and exploration for the Red Riding Hood figures, no longer explicitly and exclusively a monster. Then more specifically, I actually argue that the presence of female sexual arousal, desire, and pleasure in these texts is made possible through the presence of the enchantment and supernatural and the ability to have that monstrous relationship or animal bridegroom relationship, right? So rather than you know, it's a subversion, apologies, of the animal bridegroom tale, because rather than taming their boyfriend's sexuality as they would in a traditional animal bridegroom tale, the characters identify with these wild or beastly attributes. So they've been kind of liberated from a more passive role that we see in traditional fairy tales or fiction. Arguably, depending on what you're looking at, these female characters are able to access this only because of the presence of the supernatural, and so the texts also become a form of escapism in that way. And we can see that particularly in texts where the Red Riding Hood character, apologies, develops her own sort of supernatural abilities. So she might become the wolf character herself, or she might just become a wolf or a werewolf alongside. So I already talked about like the monstrous appetite. So just to finish, I want to mention, you know, in contemporary attitudes surrounding women and female sexuality, we often see a really common conflation of sexual and gustatory appetites. So, you know, hunger is a sexual hunger as well as a hunger for food. But this sexualization of it is frequently only deemed like positive or allowed, as it were, if they're performed by women who are otherwise acceptably feminine. So women who deviate from traditional femininity or who don't meet the ideal body shape or who eat badly, you know, they're seen as monstrous and inappropriate. And we can see this in Red Riding Hood retellings where she becomes the wolf. There's a scholar called June Pulliam. She argues that representations of female lycanthropy provide, in her words, a coded exploration of issues of gender, sexuality, and agency. And it confirms patriarchy's worst fears about the natural monstrosity of women. We have anxieties around lycanthropic characters, representative of contemporary anxieties surrounding adolescent girls and girlhood. So the boundaries of correct gender, sexuality, and agency are explored through their unrestrained appetite, through their ability to consume, whether that be through hunting animals or eating garbage or hunting and eating humans, often boys, to be honest, if we are doing like female werewolves. And this is where, I know we were talking about it before, but this is generally where people mention ginger snaps, which again, great movie, but not really part of what I'm studying, but a really good exploration of female hunger in there. I would argue that Jennifer's body is quite similar. She's not a werewolf in there, but it is still sort of cycling around that fear of monstrosity and hunger. And that goes down the path of the fear of, you know, sexual behavior as consumption, as the Freudian sort of vagina dentata mythology. So there's a little pathway down there. And in general, Pulliam actually argues that positive representations of werewolf characters construct lycanthropy as a condition that enables humans to shake off some of the repressive effects of civilization. And that last bit was a quote from her. So the bazoo of the Grandmother's Tale and the wolves in Egbert of Liège's About a Girl Saved from Wolf Cubs, and Perrault's, you know, more smooth, charming, like charismatic wolf, they act as humanity's fear of possession, monstrosity, and violence. But the werewolf characters of more contemporary retellings allow for this different interpretation. And so they provide the space for the exploration of alternative, albeit currently fictional, ways of living and ways of existing. That is it. Thank you.